Welcome to the Ayaan Hirsi podcast, a home for critical thinking and common sense. I'm thrilled to welcome Christopher Rufo to my podcast today. He's doing impressive work fighting critical race theory across the country, and I was very excited to sit down with him. Christopher Rufo is a senior fellow and director of the Initiative on Critical Race Theory at the Manhattan Institute. He's also a contributing editor at City Journal, where his writing explores a range of issues, including critical race theory, homelessness, addiction, crime, and the decline of cities on America's West Coast. Christopher, welcome to my podcast. I am a huge admirer of your work, and I want to start by asking you, where did you grow up?
Yeah, I grew up in Sacramento, California, and the son of an immigrant from Italy, my father, and an immigrant from Detroit, Michigan, my mother, and grew up in a kind of suburban neighborhood in Sacramento.
That makes it even more interesting because, we think of California as totally blue, and you are conservative, but I'll get to that later. And then where did you go to school? In Sacramento?
Yeah, no, I went to, through public education, K through 12 in Sacramento. And then I spent 3 years studying at Georgetown in DC. So that was my college experience.
Yeah. And what an experience. First of all, you graduated magna cum laude. But what I think I want to get into, just given your age and the issues that you write on and you're focusing on now, is what was that experience like, going to school, going to high school, going to college, and from a conservative family?
Well, yeah, it's actually kind of funny. It's something that has been strange for me to see. I'm kind of this image in the media as a kind of arch conservative opposer of critical race theory. But, when I was growing up, I was would describe myself as on the far left. Wow. Certainly as a teenager, I was on the left. I remember my relatives in Italy, I have, very tight connections. I'm a native Italian speaker, an Italian citizen. My whole family is still in Italy, and they're committed leftists. I remember going to my aunt's house as a 10 or 11-year-old and seeing on her bookshelf the collected works of V.I. Lenin. They are, really kind of unreconstructed communists. And I say that with a lot of affection for my family members. And I remember I even bought a Che Guevara flag when I was maybe 12 or 13 while I was in Italy that they had gifted to me, and I put it in my room. So I grew up in a very much of a more of a left-leaning environment, and it actually changed when I got to Washington, D.C., when I got to Georgetown. I arrived, got involved in left-wing politics. At the time, I was marching against the Iraq War, but something felt so phony about it. Just the personalities of, Georgetown. These are the people, the most elite people from all over the world. And they're acting and pretending and cosplaying as these great leftist champions of the people. And at that time, instinctively, intuitively, it all kind of fell apart for me. I said, this isn't the kind of beautiful idea of the left that I had envisioned. Once I met the actual human beings that were trying to complete this project, I recoiled from it, and I took about 10 years away from politics completely after that.
And how old were you when, let's say, from the, awakening, or from, the time when you got this insight to when you decided to actually oppose it?
Yeah, it took about 10 years. I spent the following 10 years after I graduated from college working as a documentary filmmaker. I directed films for PBS. I directed ones for Netflix. And I traveled all over the world, I think 60, 70 countries around the world. And at the same time, I was doing my own kind of voracious reading and studying, looking at political works on the right, on the left, trying to understand in theoretical terms what I was seeing empirically in my documentary work. And over a kind of maybe a long period of time, it dawned on me, it's like, oh my gosh, what I see in the world, what I see as reality, my best interpretation and experience aligns much more with conservative thinkers, conservative writers, conservative ideas. And it took me maybe a little bit to accept it because it felt at first very strange to me. And I think that's why maybe I'm able to communicate to people across a bit broader spectrum than your typical, college Republican style conservative. It's because I know what the other side believes. I was once there myself, and maybe that's why I can communicate to them.
Yeah, and it's really important, and I think we're going to get into that once we start talking about solutions. That what we need is a collaboration, and not sort of. I hate to use their language, but othering, or seeing your opponents, people with different perspectives, as the enemy instead of simply someone with a different perspective. Anyway, so you go through all of this, and then you make these documentaries. I am interested in one of them in particular, which is the one of America Lost and the three forgotten American cities. Can you elaborate, first of all, on the key message of that documentary, and why did you choose those three cities?
Yeah, it's a look at these three forgotten cities. The first is Youngstown, Ohio, Rust Belt, white working class neighborhood, former steel town. The second is Memphis, Tennessee, in South Memphis, specifically a zip code called 38126. It's the fourth poorest zip code in the country. It's a kind of urban black neighborhood. And then third is Stockton, California, the central part of the city, which is Latino, Asian, black, white, Native American, a very much multiracial, distinctively kind of West Coast city. And I made the film because I wanted to understand what is happening to these places that were once thriving, all-American cities that have just absolutely collapsed. What is happening? And I set out initially making the film to try to do a very simplistic analysis looking back. So, well, what policies did they pursue, and why did they not work, and why did these cities fail? Looking at it through the lens of economics, through the lens of public policy. And as I got into the field, as I started spending months and then years actually meeting families, meeting people in the community, meeting the important players in these places, I realized that the problem facing these cities that, again, are multiracial, spread across geographically, are a similar set of problems. But they're not necessarily economic or political at heart. They become social and cultural and familial and psychological. It's like trying to peer into the spiritual crisis of American poverty. And then from there, looking at all the other angles of economics and family structure. And one of the big takeaways, and I think it's really relevant to my current work, is that increasingly in America, people like you and I, we come from a similar kind of socioeconomic. We have a similar kind of socioeconomic status, even though we might be different racial and ancestral backgrounds. We have more in common with one another than I have with a poor white working class person in Youngstown, Ohio. And to the extent that we focus on problems like poverty and inequality, we should be looking at what unites people and transcends these backgrounds, because, again, people are facing similar problems, whatever their background.
That's absolutely true. And you are looking at these things and coming to these conclusions and thinking, okay, this isn't political or economical. What's more important are the cultural facts. And it's just right in the middle of these culture wars that are heating up, but also in academia, this deafness or this willfulness to not want to talk about culture. So there's this mismatch between what you're seeing and researchers, still emphasizing political policy issues and economic issues. How do you deal with this?
Well, it is one of the most stunning, and I think in effect is a massive condemnation of what's happening in academia. I mean, you have all this battle. We're saying, well, if Jeff Bezos paid higher tax rates, that would bring justice and an end to inequality. If you tax Jeff Bezos, I really don't care. Jeff Bezos is going to be fine. You could take all of his money tomorrow. Is that really going to make life better for someone on the south side of Memphis? Of course not. People live in culture. Culture is fundamental to people's actual experience as human beings. Your family, your relationships, your employment, your beliefs and attitudes, your faith. And for some reason, it's become a taboo in many academic settings to even talk about that. Even the mention of culture You see academics kind of tighten up and get anxious, but that's what life is. And I think that we have to address those things, not as attacking cultures, but to try to find, what is meaningful for people in life, and what are those cultural structures that, in my view, have been shredded in many communities in the United States, and what can we do to bring them back, to revive them, to reimagine them, to reinvent them, so that no matter who you are, you can have a dignified life in this country. And that was really the key message of the film. And I think one thing that is kind of funny is that as that became the message in the film, my counterparts at PBS started to get a little bit nervous. My counterparts in the documentary world started to say, "Oh my gosh," there was whispers, "I think Christopher Rufo, I think he's a conservative." Yeah. I even had people who I had worked with for years, contractors that I had hired, said, "Hey, I'm sorry, we've worked together in the past, but I can't work with you anymore because of your political, development, because of your political beliefs."
And let's, delve into them, because these aren't, as you describe, political beliefs. They are observations that you're making. Let's start with the institution of family. What is it that you saw in that zip code in Memphis or Youngstown, Ohio, or Stockton, California? These families, I don't want to put words in your mouth. What are you seeing? Yeah.
I mean, it's simple, and I think we have to evolve our language, because there's a conservative attitude or vocabulary from the 1980s that was against, welfare queens, against single mothers, and that rhetoric has kind of a harsh edge to it, has a judgmental edge to it. But I think the fundamental analysis, if you take away the loaded language, is fundamentally right. You have in Memphis, Tennessee, in the 38126 zip code, for example, 92% of families are single parent households.
Wow.
It's a zip code with 6,000 total residents, but there are only 10 nuclear families. So there are only 10 households with a mother, a father, and children in an entire zip code of 6,000 people. And this is not a political issue. I mean, if you look at human history in every culture, having a kind of either a nuclear household or a nuclear household plus larger kinship structures is a human universal. America is the first society in human history to attempt this experiment where we can have predominantly single parent and single mother households raising kids. And you don't have to take my word for it. I'm not saying this is my judgment and I'm casting it upon people in this community. I listened to hundreds and hundreds of people. I recorded thousands of hours of footage, and the pain and suffering and trauma and desperation from people in their own words was something that brought me to tears many times, because they're struggling, they're suffering, and they recognize better than any social scientist or university professor the enormously high cost of this social experiment. I mean, it should be something that unites all of us to say, I don't know. I don't know your family background, but for me, and I think almost everyone else, it's the family is the key, is the key ingredient in shaping your life. And we should want that to be the strongest possible structure for every kid in our country.
And then these 10 nuclear families in the 32186 zip code, what you saw there, the intact families, was it's the, same zip code, same environment, but was that different from the single parent households?
Yeah, I didn't meet many of them. I think I met two of them, single parent or kind of two parent households. And the difference in those cases, I don't know if it's representative, although I expect it would be, is these were households that were low income, but they had very strong faith, very strong Christian principles, values, practices. And that's something I also saw. And again, this is a taboo in the kind of secular university and academic and social scientific world. But the bedrock of a community like South Memphis, again, not my opinion, it's an empirical observation, and I think would be verified by people in the community, is that founding bedrock, that one thing that is still standing that provides a sense of cohesion, a sense of meaning, are these unbelievably beautiful church and religious communities. And, those families that are able to maintain it, I think the faith component protects them and shields them from a lot of the violence, destruction, drug abuse, and other forms of social pathology that they find themselves engulfed in. It gives them this kind of sense of kind of moral strength that I thought was just inspiring and a thing of great beauty.
And also educational. I think being a young man from a completely different parts of America, you found your process of this. This has been, I can share this with you, that it is through experience, actually through looking and seeing for myself how other people live, whether they were leading better lives, more protected lives than the one that I knew, or whether they were meeting more challenges and more adversity. It is really through seeing these things that I think I found my education into these things. And I still am not at a place where I'm calling myself a conservative. I call myself a classical liberal. But, I've come to precisely the same conclusions that you have, again, through what I think of as empirical evidence, which is now, people have decided, okay, we can't change reality, so we're just going to pretend it doesn't exist and make an enemy of, empirics and reason and rationality. But we'll get into that when we talk about CRT. And from there, Christopher, you go into trying to understand poverty, homelessness, addiction, crime, other afflictions. I saw a small video of your reporting on San Francisco, and I just can't believe what's going on in the city. The way the whole place is being overtaken by the homeless. Please describe what you saw.
Yeah, I mean, San Francisco is probably the best illustration of governance by progressive ideology. It is the best illustration of what you call a resistance to facts and evidence and empirical data. And they've essentially created a policy on homelessness that buys into the entire range of progressive tropes. The idea that homelessness is caused by economic inequality and racism and other, and capitalism and other very big ideas. And that, what we need is a policy of unlimited and maximal compassion, because those are the answers to all of the problems. And what they miss is the obvious truth. Anyone who walks through the Tenderloin is going to see a couple things. They're going to see people shooting up. They're going to see people smoking fentanyl off of tinfoil strips. They're going to see people nodded out and passed out on the side of the road. And they're going to see predominantly Honduran and El Salvadoran open-air drug dealers that are servicing these tent encampment communities that surround them and enforce the kind of law with violence. When I was there reporting, I saw people walking around with axes on their back. I mean, actual in the open air, patrolling the streets of San Francisco, drug cartels with axes. And then you have San Francisco's political leaders to say, well, we just need to offer them, a nice place to stay and a little more compassion. But what they miss is that the predominant drivers of homelessness are drug addiction, are severe mental illness like schizophrenia, severe bipolar disorder. And actually, by applying compassion with no complementary value of enforcement or maintaining public order, you just end up incentivizing and then trapping people in these horrendous and inhumane conditions. But despite, it's like you have people that they see it. You can't not see it. It's everywhere. But they choose to be intellectually blind. They choose to not acknowledge this and just say, well, we need to go forth. It's like the old 5-year plans from the Soviet Union. You have starving peasants in the countryside, and they say, we just need to, invest more in Soviet agricultural science. If we do it again, it's going to be great. And and these things have tremendous social consequences. And I think San Francisco promises compassion and delivers cruelty. That's my fundamental takeaway.
Because it's not compassion. And I just have this vivid image of you talking to one of the political leaders, and she's standing there when you ask her the question, what do you think of this? And she starts complaining. She says this is an effect of Republican policies. And, my jaw dropped. I thought, where are the Republicans in San Francisco? Are you kidding me? And she stood there, and to me, she seemed herself to be out of her mind. Just, if you forget about everything else and just listen to the reasons she gave, her incompetency, and it didn't come across as compassion. It came across as someone who is completely out of touch and out of her depth. And so I really don't think this is anything about compassion. It has nothing to do with compassion. It has everything to do with virtue signaling. It has everything to do with these people feeling good about themselves. But I don't think that they care about the homeless and the individual human beings on the streets who are struggling with mental health issues, with addiction, or the victims of their crimes. You spoke to another resident who said she saw people having sex on the streets and it didn't even come across as consensual. So basically, there's rape going on. And what, is it the fault of the Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, I think I know all of the Republicans in San Francisco. There's maybe a half dozen of them. I mean, it's so preposterous, and yet it works. I think the question that kind of goes through my mind, and it's a very question that suggests some scary conclusions, is like, I think, you saw the interview. I'm talking with this county council member in San Francisco. She seems completely out of her mind, totally disconnected from reality. And yet she speaks in the language of abstractions that move votes, that move power, that move policy, and that generate billions of dollars per year in tax revenues. And then they're choosing to set the rules of the game. And then if you say, hey, look, you had, 300 overdose deaths. You have a kind of mass rape of vulnerable women in these encampments. And you have Honduran drug cartels that have essentially established territorial independence in a neighborhood that is filled with vulnerable, predominantly Asian American immigrants that I saw having to Asian American school children, I think Chinese American school children, holding onto a rope line, being led by their teacher through homeless encampments, through open air drug markets, through the plumes of smoke of lit fentanyl. Yeah. These are people who came to this country and we're subjecting them to these horrific conditions. And yet we have the political class that's like just consumed by their own ideological fantasies, consumed by the pleasant sound of their own abstractions. And then, what does this mean? I mean, they have cemented power and status and all of the things in their own elite world. How long can this last? That's the question that I always ask is, when does reality start to actually break open this ideological stranglehold? And every time I think that it's about to happen, unfortunately, it keeps going further. So I guess we don't know the answer to that question quite yet.
Well, it takes us straight into CRT, critical race theory and critical justice theory, because I think therein lie the underpinnings of these philosophies and these ideologies. And I wanted to ask, when was your first encounter with this phenomenon, CRT, CJT, so critical justice, critical race theory?
So it's something that I had been aware of as just a kind of newsreader and observer for a number of years. But the first time it came across my desk as a kind of professional point of reflection and contemplation was actually an anonymous tip from a City of Seattle employee who said, Chris, you need to look at the City of Seattle's, this is so totalitarian, this is like Orwellian to its core. The Office of Civil Rights of the City of Seattle is forcing its employees through internalized white supremacy training, in which they have to stand up, announce their pronouns, announce their race, admit that they're complicit in white supremacist systems, and then atone for their white privilege and their white fragility and their internalized supremacy, and commit to the racial justice narrative that is promulgated by this Office of Civil Rights. And I put in a records request, and it wasn't my beat at that time. And I got the thing back. They sent me a CD-ROM, actually, like one of those old CD-ROM discs that you'd put in a car stereo.
Right.
And I called my friend. I said, "Hey man, do you have a CD-ROM reader? I don't even have one." And I opened this PDF file, and my jaw just smacks against my desk. This stuff was so virulently and just obviously racist, and intellectually shoddy and hyper ideological. And then coming from the Office of Civil Rights, I was just astonished. And I broke the story thinking, oh, this is a one-off story. This is something that is kind of interesting, what's happening in Seattle. And this story just exploded. And all of a sudden, there was this deluge, this huge influx of leakers from federal government, from the corporate world, from K through 12 education, hundreds and then thousands of people sending me PDFs, documents, videos, and saying, my workplace is being indoctrinated with these same principles. I'm too scared to say anything about it. Mm-hmm. But can you tell my story? And from there, it was like this beautiful moment of like a kind of swashbuckling reporter where I get all these scoops and leads and I'm just riding this wave. And it took me in this direction that is so strange. I never would have guessed that I'd be here. I never would have guessed that I'd be the kind of champion fighting back against this ideology. But it's one of those things. It's kind of a life surprise, a life opportunity, a life call to adventure. Yeah. And I took it, and it's been, just immensely rewarding. And
I think, I don't know. I mean, I'm so glad you saw it and immediately something clicked. But I've been seeing it. Other observers have been seeing it, but we've only been seeing it in college. And we used to think, you know what, this is just a weird fad. And it's going to go away because these students are going to graduate and they're going to come in touch with real life and they're going to shed it. But what you're observing is actually the opposite is true. They don't shed it. They spread it, and they spread into everything and everywhere.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, conservatives made a big error there. Conservatives, maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they would mock those students. They'd say, oh, look at these gender studies and critical studies graduates, with their blue hair. They're not going to get a job. They're going to be living in their mom's basement because these are not productive ideas in the real world. Huge error. I mean, catastrophically large error, terrible messaging, terrible pushback, because what happened is that the United States has become bureaucratized, I think in a way that is most similar, this might be provocative, to the way that something like the USSR was bureaucratized, mm-hmm. where you have entire departments, not only within government, but also within schools, within corporations, within other institutional environments, certainly within universities, where they are insulated from the discipline and the feedback of market mechanisms. And their entire purpose is ideological. So like in the Soviet Union, you'd have what were called commissars or political officers in military branches, in kind of industrial firms, and in, government agencies. We have the same thing in the United States. The Diversity and Inclusion Office of Walt Disney Corporation serves the same function as the Office of Women and Minority Inclusion in the Department of the Treasury, and serves the same function as the Minority Student Affairs Office at University of California at Berkeley. These are bureaucracies that live off the largesse of American capitalism and wealth productivity. Right. But they are explicitly designed to enforce orthodoxy. So that gender studies graduate that learned about this in college has now moved into the bureaucracy in one of these places. And they have arguments that are very hard for people to resist, very hard for people to push back against. And consequently, they're able to use their position to ideologize the entire institution. And I think we're honestly, kind of in my pessimistic moment, I think we're only at the beginning of that process. But then, of course, with people like you and your work, there must be a sentiment that these people should be held accountable.
Because here's one thing. When I was in the Netherlands and I went into politics, of course, I was, like all the other politicians, familiarized with special interests, with various ideologies, all competing for government resources, government time, trying to get their legislation through, all that sort of thing. But there were other institutions whose job was to hold people in office accountable. Like, what did you do with that money? And then, I mean, I'm not saying those places were perfect. I'm just saying when things went wrong, we had crises. And then we sat down and said, okay, how did this come about? Who's responsible? Where did the resources go, etc.? Don't we have a framework that is devoted just to holding these people accountable, people in government, people in the media, people in academia? How does it work in the US? And I know I've been here long enough to understand that, but I just find it baffling.
And what I found, actually, I had the same assumption that you did. I said, all right, well, there are institutions and processes and laws and inspector generals and investigators and Senate offices that will be, once they find out what's happening, they will take immediate action and hold these folks accountable. What I discovered, honestly, that shocked me is that nobody is holding them accountable. I was going around from institution to institution, to think tanks, to law firms, to Senate offices, to all of the people who ostensibly are in positions of great power. And I said, who's working on this? Who can we find to sue? Who can we find to take this accountable? And they said, we're all looking around. Well, we don't know. Nobody really. This has just kind of not been on our radar. And it did two things. One, it kind of surprised me, like, whoa, the structures of power in the United States are not what I thought they were.
Right.
But second, I said, all right, well, if you guys aren't going to do it, if there's no one else working on it, I'm going to do it. And I remember when I first said, hey, a lot of this stuff that's happening in classrooms, a lot of the CRT principles, like teaching white third graders that they're inherently oppressors, or forcing, teachers to undergo struggle sessions in which minority employees are allowed to denounce white employees for 90 seconds with no repercussions. These are not only kind of horrific, vaguely Maoist practices, but they should be illegal under American law.
Yeah.
And who's suing them? And the answer was nobody. So I got this. I said, all right, well, I'm going to do it. I'm not an attorney. I don't know what I'm doing, but I put out the call for lawyer volunteers, and I had this amazing ragtag group of people. It was like personal injury attorneys, third-year law students that were just trying to pass the bar exam, this kind of like motley crew of people who were just like, this isn't my expertise. I'm a new lawyer. I'm a solo practitioner. I'm not a big institution. I'll file a suit for you. And we started filing these lawsuits in federal court. We started going up against the biggest corporate law firms in DC and New York. And all of a sudden people started to say, oh, wow, like we can just do this. And then over about 3 to 6 months, all of the bigger firms started saying, we want to play on this field too. So now we've finally started to mount a real opposition. But it starts with you. I mean, look at what you've done. It's unbelievable. Like, as an individual, you've had a ripple effect across the world. And I think that's what I've really learned, and you exemplify better than anybody that I know, is that courage is the single greatest virtue required of our time. And that courage, a demonstration of individual courage can, and an embrace of a clear principle can have a real world effect that can topple some of these structures of power that seem to be insurmountable.
Absolutely. And I think perhaps it begins with understanding the dynamics, the power dynamics, and, the nitty-gritty of this ideology and how it manifests itself. I have small children. So one of the things that I find alarming, and I think that all parents with children should find alarming, is, first of all, what goes on in teacher training colleges and how these teachers are indoctrinated into the ideology. And then when they come to schools, they're deployed into schools, how that is changing K to 12. K to 12 is this period of time, I think, when parents trust schools the most. And a lot of parents these days, men and women, work. So it's really difficult to see what exactly it is that your child is learning, going through. And in a way, I think maybe the pandemic, a positive side effect of the pandemic might be that as parents, we got acquainted with CRT, with what our kids are being indoctrinated with. And you describe it, but I'd like you to do it in your words because you're so much better at it than I am.
Yeah, that was a focus of my reporting over the last few months, was really trying to show people what is actually happening in classrooms. And I'll give you a couple examples, because what I found is that we can always debate ideas in the abstract and it gets muddled. But when you break it down to a narrative and a fact, it actually moves people, and it gets you out of this like kind of back and forth and into a spirit of tangible thinking. So Seattle Public Schools, they held a training session for teachers that said that, quote, white teachers, quote, spirit murder Black children. And it told white teachers to, quote, bankrupt their privilege in acknowledgement of their thieved inheritance. In Cupertino, Cupertino, California, very wealthy Bay Area suburb. Yeah. They forced third graders. These are like 8-year-olds to deconstruct their racial and sexual identities in class and then rank themselves according to their power and privilege. They told the white, male, heterosexual third graders that they held all of the power in society, and told the minority, female, kind of sexual minority, that they had no agency in the world because of their identity. And then one that I'll share one more that is just crazy is a Philadelphia elementary school that has 13% literacy rate. So after graduating from middle school, only 13% of their kids can read and write at basic proficiency. Yeah. They marched fifth graders into the auditorium to celebrate communism and then simulate a Black Power rally to free Angela Davis from prison. It is hardcore kind of 1960s style Black radicalism that they're pumping into these kids, even though in 8 years of education, they can only teach just north of 10% of them how to read and write. This is what's happening in public education, in the public education system. And, parents should be absolutely up in arms. This is endangering, not only these kids, most importantly, but endangering the larger project of the country. Absolutely. Absolutely, without a doubt. And by the way, it's not only in public schools. Barry Weiss had a piece in the City Journal documenting the way this thing is also affecting private schools, where parents pay upwards of 30,000, 40,000, even 50,000 K a year, and their kids are being indoctrinated with this BS. Yeah, those are the ones that I find like most absurd, because you have you literally the most privileged people in the history of humanity. I mean, without a doubt, in these very affluent schools that are feeders to the Ivies, that are adopting this ideology that is so disconnected from their actual experience and their actual world. I mean, the gap between those two things is so extraordinary. It's like you're brainwashing these kids into this ideology and this like fake self-hatred and fake self-denouncement. I mean, it is so crazy. And I think what Barry has done, and Caitlin Flanagan at The Atlantic has done, is show that center-left audience, that center-left elite audience. Mm-hmm. You are buying into an ideology that is phony, divisive, destructive, and you should be ashamed of yourself, and you should be publicly held to account for pushing this stuff in your institutions. But these parents and center-left liberals, especially the privileged ones, are guilt-ridden. They are scared. They are terrified that then they will be held responsible for the crisis in homelessness, the crisis in addiction, the crisis in crime. It's because they have all the good things. This is what's being said to them. And so they're put in a position that they're sacrificing their children and the future of their children, and ultimately the future of the country,
so as not to be confronted with, in my view, this phony, fake, white guilt narrative.
Yeah, and I think that if you look at it, you can only describe these people as cowards. And I think we shouldn't mince words about it, because they know that it's wrong. They know that it's absurd. They know that it's fake, but they don't want to be perceived as conservative, which in our society is low status. They don't want to be perceived as being against anti-racism, again, a low status perception. And they don't want to jeopardize their kids' chances to get into Harvard and Yale and Princeton. That to them is like, they're the guiding reason you would put your kid in Dalton or Brearley or Harvard Westlake is to give them a comfortable escalator ride into America's elites. And they're willing to accept an ideology that is totally nonsensical as a status cementing mechanism. And I think that's what it is. It's like, for these folks, like, they don't care what's happening to the poor families that I spent 3 years with in South Memphis. Having a diversity training at Harvard Westlake is not going to alleviate the suffering of actual homeless people that live in the adjacent neighborhood in Los Angeles. But for them, it gives them a currency in their own elite world. And it gives them the sense that, we care, we are enlightened, we have the right beliefs. And then they can offload their guilt by scapegoating Republicans, white working class, conservatives, all of the bad remnants of society that they think that if we could get rid of, we could finally install our beautiful utopian dreams and solve all these problems. I mean, it's like, for me, and as a person where I have entry in all of these worlds. I live in a small rural town, but I also, would feel comfortable on the campus of Yale or, in a boardroom somewhere. So I kind of see all these perspectives, and you see the jockeying for position that's at the heart of a lot of this stuff. And I just, again, it's like, goes back to what I was talking to about going to college and seeing these people, masquerading as, Che Guevara revolutionaries. It's so phony. I think that we need, if we could revive one human being, it would be Tom Wolfe, the great novelist. We need you, Tom, please. Is there a scientist that can revive this man? We need him so desperately, because he pointed out all of these absurdities in a way that I think is desperately needed again.
And, I just want to be a little bit more compassionate, real compassion, and by not dismissing them as arrogant or as, status seeking, because it's still, to me, baffling. Why, you pay all this money, you send your kid to school, they get indoctrinated with this ideology that actually compromises the self-esteem of your own child and the quality education. These universities, in terms of, elite and Ivy League, I think that status has now become questionable, because the more they produce graduates that are in a mental crisis, that can, barely do their jobs, that can barely live in the real world, the more that their status is going to be questioned. In fact, off the record, I've had lots of parents thinking seriously about sending their children to different countries for education, because our education system from K to 12 all the way to our Ivy League universities is in some sort of crisis. You know how the status of mathematics is being challenged, the hard sciences are being challenged. All of these things are racist, systemically racist, and so on. So the institutions that are there to establish or to generate thinkers and professionals are not doing their job. So lots of people are trying to find a way out of this.
Where do they go? That'd be my question. What countries or institutions are they considering as alternatives?
So I'm seeing a lot of cropping up of schools K to 12, elementary type of schools, maybe even high schools. In different countries, we are friends with people who have started a school in Croatia, in France, even here in the US. Just look up homeschooling and you will see suddenly how remember how that was very, very low status? And now it's become, it's trending because the parents who actually do care about what it is in terms of education that their kids are ingesting don't like what they're seeing, so they're starting their own. And it is just a matter of time before high quality teachers, this is a market mechanism, high quality teachers and parents who care about their kids before these supply and demand, before that finds it one another. And I wouldn't be surprised if these alternative schools start and then you get inequality even more entrenched, because you will have a small group of kids, a relatively small group of kids who will be highly educated and truly seriously educated. And then you will have, kids who will be in large numbers, unfortunate enough to be left to the public schools unless we change the tide. And I think that it's very important for us to put up a good fight, and in a relentless way, exactly the way you're doing it, to fight this thing. And the only way to do it is to show parents, and particularly liberal parents and elite parents, exactly what it is that their kids are exposed to. It cannot possibly be high status.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, I think we should also think about, and I think what I'm trying to do now is a very tactical game. I think of myself as like lobbing hand grenades in to try to blow up the enemy ideas. I think of myself as like a fighter right now, but I'd also like to think a bit more long-term, a bit more structurally. And the question that you pose is, on one hand, I'm inspired by people who say, I don't like this. I'm going to build an alternative. I'm going to build a new institution that is better. That's like music to my ears. I love it. Right. But the dark side of that is, as you described, the potential for a greater division in our society, a greater inequality. And I think that the solution we have to think of is elites drive policy, right? Yeah. You can't dismiss them. You have to try to co-opt them. You have to try to change the incentives for them. But also, like, who's thinking about those kids that are trapped in these abysmal schools? And what can we do structurally to try to make it better? And I think a lot of it's going to happen. A lot of it has to happen with providing those kids that are in Buffalo public schools, Philadelphia public schools, in New York City public schools that aren't working, give them an exit. I think, like, we have to say every child in this country has the right to an education that provides human dignity, that provides them a pathway to a life that is meaningful and full of opportunity, that allows them to fulfill their potential. And if we have a system that doesn't do that, we have to give every kid the right to exit, the right to attend a school that reflects their values, or have to attend a school that will give them that potential for dignity.
And I think the path to that is exposure. The more people find out about the ins and outs of critical race theory, critical justice theory, and wokeness in all its manifestations, the more they reject it. And I see this with Black people. I see it with my Asian friends. I see it. I really see it everywhere. Behind closed doors, people will say exactly what it is that they think of critical race theory. You just then need more exposure, but for more people to find courage in numbers and come out against it. And I think what you said when we started this conversation about, reaching out to the liberals, making sure that there is common cause with conservatives and liberals. This is something that we need to collaborate on. That only then can we achieve the urgent and absolutely necessary job of pushing back against this present day ideology that is evil and divisive.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think it has to be broader. And this is a complicated question, though, is how can we take an intellectual movement, right? You can call it anti-woke. I don't think that's the best description, but that's one that we have for now, which I think is very broad based. You have people on the center left, people on the center right, you have, conservatives writ large. But I think we have to be very strategic in how we structure this alliance. And I think center left liberals need to understand that in order to achieve actual political results, they're going to have to make an alliance with conservatives, with people who are probably very different than they are. Because ultimately we have a two-party political system, and Republicans are willing to move on this. Conservatives are willing to move on this. And the Democrats have been captured. The Liberal Party has been captured by its furthest elements. And conservatives on our part, I consider myself a conservative. Right. We need to be much more open to building bridges to that center left. And, frankly, this is a thing where I agree with a lot of the rhetoric. We need to have better representation. Conservatives can't be, we need to have much better language of welcoming people in. I think that's what historically conservatives have done a poor job with. Yeah. And I like to think of myself as a bridge. Like, my community here in my small town is very diverse, variety of backgrounds. My own friend circle is very diverse. And I think there's this opportunity where we can actually break the stranglehold of tribal racial politics, to say that what divides us is not our skin color or our family origin, but actually these ideas. And I think the more we can do that, the more that we can actually have that fight and resist that temptation to divide along those really ugly and crude identity lines. To try to look, you can't transcend them 100%. We have differences, but let's move towards that as much as we can. And I'm seeing that happening. And I'm seeing, like, a lot of my allies. Yeah. I have great allies that are like hardcore right-wing Republicans, in Congress. But I also have these allies that are like reporters at the Intercept and the New York Times and the Atlantic. Some of them are publicly, allies. Some of them are privately allies. But there's this thing happening right now. And I think we need to really work on cultivating it and building it and creating this movement that I think, with no exaggeration, could save the United States as a country.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And I think, honestly, it has to be very, very local. And starting on the micro level, you started by saying that the most important institution is the family. And I think it's on that level, with families and parents getting together, regardless of what their political affiliation is, and it's, starting or joining the movement of anti-CRT. This is literally fighting for the education of your own children and awakening to this thing. So I don't think, if we get into on the federal level, Republicans and Democrats and how these various parties are operating and their failures, I think we then maybe inadvertently we'll just get lost in politicizing everything more, and we get sucked into the tribal sentiment. But if it is just about, I want my kids to be able to read and write. I want them to be able to be at a certain level in math when they're in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade. That is more of a common interest that parents have, regardless of their political background or affiliation. And that is, I think, where we need to go. So I'm really grateful to you for spending as much time as you did on what's going on in schools. And also schools, education is it's the foundation of the country. How are we ever going to stand up to China and Russia and other adversaries if our children and our elite are ill-educated?
Yeah, I know. And I think that's exactly right. And on the optimistic side, I still am convinced that the large majority of Americans believe in the country. They believe in academic excellence. They believe that we must be competitive and judge kids on their merits and their achievements. These are still, I think, the bedrock values of the majority of people. But these institutions have been hijacked by a small minority that uses the weapons of ideology and rhetoric and politics to impose their will in the institution. So to me, that's the battleground. And I agree 100%. It's one of the coolest things that's happened for me in the last couple months is, a year ago, nobody had heard about critical race theory. It was not a national issue. No one's thinking about it. And I've just been like beating this drum and generating support and weaving in politics. And now it's like, I see videos of like apoplectic suburban moms in like Dallas, shouting down the school boards to say, get critical race theory out of this school, or in Virginia where there are Asian and Indian American parents that are saying, don't destroy our math program, or Chinese American parents in Cupertino, protesting and saying, we want our kids to be excellent. We don't want our kids to be judged on the basis of their race. Get this out of here. And like to think, and this is maybe a bit like, I don't know, I don't want to be like egotistical about it, but it's like, for me, I feel like, wow, I had a part in this. Like my actions, 6 months ago, writing at my computer and speaking on TV, like, I think they had this like weird domino effect where now these people are expressing themselves. And what I like to think of as like my greatest dream and vision is, I want to do stuff in my little way as one individual person that can spark and inspire people to awaken their own values, their own confidence, their own courage. And that's how it's going to get done. And I think like we're starting to see that in these small ways in these communities. And what it is, it's multiracial, it's multi socioeconomic class, and it's people that are committed to these very basic principles. And I love it. I love to see it.
And you've done your part and you're still doing it, and in a most effective way, in a fantastic way. And I'm really, really grateful. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. And I'm sorry to take you away from your incredibly important work, but it was, I'm trying to reach out to younger people, millennials, Gen Z. They're the ones who are going to grow up in this country. And unfortunately, they're the ones who are going to be confronted with the consequences of critical race theory.
Both. Yeah.
Both, yeah. So thank you so much, Christopher. Thank you for doing this. And I hope that they can, by listening to you, that you're setting a wonderful example. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ayaan Hirsi Ali podcast. Next week, we've got another exciting guest for you. If you're enjoying these conversations, please subscribe to support this podcast at ayaanhirsiali.com.